There's a specific kind of suffering that nobody talks about. It's not poverty. It's not heartbreak. It's waking up and feeling like time is passing you by, and everyone else has already figured out something you haven't. Your peers are getting promoted, getting married, buying houses, building businesses, and you're still here, still waiting for something to click. Nobody tells you how loud that silence gets. You scroll through someone's highlight reel, and something tightens in your chest. Not envy exactly. Something quieter. Something closer to shame. And the worst part isn't the feeling itself. The worst part is that you can't explain it to anyone without sounding weak. So you carry it alone. Here's what I want you to sit with before we go any further. What if that feeling isn't evidence that you're behind? What if it's evidence that you've been measuring yourself with the wrong ruler? 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers sat with the same tension. They didn't write self-help books. They didn't sell courses. They wrote letters to each other about how a man should carry himself when the world refuses to cooperate with his plans. What they figured out is still the most psychologically precise framework ever developed for this specific pain. We're going to go through 7 of those principles today, and I'll warn you now. Some of these are going to make you uncomfortable. Not because they're harsh, because they're accurate. Most men aren't suffering from failure. They're suffering from a fiction. At some point, without consciously deciding to, you built a timeline in your head. By 25, I'll have this. By 30, I'll be there. By 35, I'll have figured it out. Nobody gave you that timeline. You absorbed it. From your parents, from culture, from watching other people's curated performances of success. And now that timeline is running your nervous system like a background process you can't close. Epictetus was very precise about this. He distinguished between 2 categories of experience: things within our control and things outside of it. He called this the dichotomy of control, and he believed that almost all human suffering comes from confusing one for the other. Your age is not within your control. The speed at which opportunities appear is not within your control. What other people have accomplished by a certain age is not within your control. But the timeline you've built in your head? That's entirely yours. You created it. You can deconstruct it. The man who feels perpetually behind is usually not a man who lacks progress. He's a man who set an arbitrary deadline and then treated it as gospel. The first Stoic move isn't to work harder. It's to audit what you're measuring yourself against and ask whether you chose that standard or just inherited it. Dismantling the fictional timeline doesn't mean lowering your ambition. It means pointing that ambition at something real, rather than spending it on guilt about a schedule you made up. Here's something most people never examine. The suffering of feeling behind isn't really about where you are. It's about what you want. Specifically, it's about wanting external things: status, recognition, a certain life, and hinging your psychological stability on whether or not you get them. The Stoics called this misplaced desire, wanting things that are fundamentally outside your control, then experiencing anguish when they don't arrive on schedule. Epictetus put it plainly. He said, "Desire, when attached to things we cannot guarantee, produces a man who is perpetually desperate. Not sometimes, always." Think about the men you know who appear to have everything and still feel behind. New car, good job, respectable life. And they're still anxious, still comparing, still restless. That's not a success problem. That's a desire architecture problem. The Stoic solution isn't to stop wanting things. It's to redirect desire toward what you can control. Your effort, your judgment, your response to circumstances. These are things you can actually deliver to yourself. Everything else is a bet on external conditions. This reorientation sounds simple. It is not easy. Most men spend their entire lives chasing the thing they think will finally make them feel like they've arrived. The Stoics knew that day never comes, not because success is impossible, but because the mechanism of desire is infinite. Give it what it wants, and it generates a new want immediately. The man who recalibrates his desire is not a man who stops pursuing. He pursues differently, with less desperation, with more precision. And that shift in internal posture changes everything about how he operates in the world. This is where most people look away. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. The Stoics didn't treat this as a morbid exercise. They treated it as a cognitive tool, specifically designed to dissolve the noise of comparison and surface what actually matters to you. Marcus Aurelius returned to this practice constantly. He wrote about death not to depress himself, but to keep himself oriented. He understood that without the pressure of mortality as a reference point, a man will spend years chasing things he doesn't actually want. When you sit with the reality of your own death, not theoretically, but viscerally, the question of whether you're behind compared to your college roommate becomes almost laughable. The real question surfaces. Are you building a life that you would not be ashamed of at the end? Not a life that looks impressive from the outside. A life that holds up under the weight of your own honest reflection. Most men who feel behind haven't actually interrogated what they're running toward. They've just internalized someone else's definition of success and are now suffering because they haven't achieved someone else's dream on someone else's schedule. Memento mori strips all of that away. It forces a clarity that nothing else can produce. Because once you're honest about the brevity of your time here, wasted energy on comparison becomes obviously expensive. You simply cannot afford it. Use death as a filter. Run your anxiety through it. Ask, will this matter at the end? If not, you already know what to do with it. That clarity is a gift. Most people avoid it. The men who don't, they carry themselves differently. Let me stop here for a moment. Because everything I've said so far operates on the assumption that you're suffering because of how you see yourself. But there's another layer. And it's darker. Some of the men who feel most behind aren't suffering from a perception problem. They're suffering because they genuinely abandoned themselves, chose the path of least resistance, kept delaying, kept waiting for a better moment that never came. And if that's true for you, no reframe is going to fix it. You already know the diagnosis. The question is whether you're willing to sit with that honestly, without either collapsing into shame or deflecting with excuses. The next principles are for that man, the one who's past the point of needing motivation, and is now standing at the edge of a decision about who he's going to be. Amor fati. Love of fate. Not acceptance in the passive sense, not resignation, something harder than both. Nietzsche formalized the phrase, but the Stoics lived it. The concept runs through Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus both. The idea that the circumstances of your life, including the ones you didn't choose, the ones that hurt you, the ones that cost you years, are not obstacles to your life. They are your life. The man who spends his energy resenting where he started, or what he lost, or how much time passed while he was figuring things out, that man is paying twice. Once for the experience itself, once for the resentment he carries afterward. Amor fati to pretend bad things weren't bad. It asks something more precise. Can you take what happened and build with it rather than against it? Your specific failures are information that no one else has. Your specific detours gave you angles that the man who took the straight path never developed. These are not consolation prizes. They are genuine advantages, if you're willing to see them that way. The men who seem to arrive late and then catch up fast, they're usually not more talented. They're more willing to use what they have, rather than grieve what they don't. The man who masters amor fati doesn't just survive his circumstances. He stops being at war with his own history. Seneca wrote something that most men read past too quickly. He said, "It is not that I am brave, it is that I know what to dread." What he meant is that the Stoics weren't indifferent to difficulty. They deliberately chose it, not as masochism, as training, as a method of building the internal resources to handle what life would eventually bring. If you've been feeling behind, there's a high probability that somewhere along the way, you chose comfort over development. Not because you're weak, because comfort is the path of least resistance, and the human brain is wired to prefer it. But comfort has a long-term cost. Every time you avoid a difficult thing, you narrow slightly. Your tolerance for uncertainty decreases. Your confidence in your own capacity shrinks. The Stoic practice is to reverse this deliberately, not by throwing yourself into chaos, but by consistently choosing the harder option in small daily decisions. The conversation you've been avoiding, the work you keep postponing, the discipline you keep promising yourself you'll start. This isn't about punishment. It's about calibration. A man who regularly practices difficult things builds a relationship with his own capability. He stops guessing at what he can handle. He knows. And that knowledge, that grounded self-knowledge, is what separates the man who is chronically anxious about the future from the man who can look at uncertain circumstances and still move forward. The practice doesn't have to be dramatic. It has to be consistent. Start where you are, with what's directly in front of you. That's always enough. Seneca's most underrated line: omit the unnecessary. Not add more, not optimize harder, remove. The man who feels behind is usually not a man who lacks ambition or capability. He's a man doing 15 things with 60% of his attention, none of them well, all of them competing. And the Stoics had no concept of productivity in the modern sense, but they were deeply interested in the quality of attention, what they called prosos, or self-attention, the deliberate cultivation of focus, presence, and discernment about where to direct energy. Spreading yourself across too many pursuits is not ambition. It's anxiety wearing ambition's clothing. The man who feels perpetually behind often needs less on his plate, not more. Fewer goals, fewer commitments, fewer comparisons, fewer voices telling him what success is supposed to look like. Subtraction is one of the hardest things to practice in a culture that rewards addition. Adding credentials, adding goals, adding social proof, adding complexity. But a focused man with two clear objectives will consistently outperform an unfocused man with 20. This is not a limitation. This is how output actually works. What are you doing right now because you chose it? And what are you doing because you drifted into it and never stopped? The answer to that question is worth more than any productivity system you'll ever find. Now, this is the deepest one, and the hardest to sit with. Every man who feels behind is keeping a scoreboard. The problem isn't that he's keeping score. The problem is that his scoreboard is public. It's built from external validation, visible achievements, and other people's metrics. Epictetus was blunt about this. He said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." The internal standard comes first, not the external reward, not the recognition, not the proof that other people can see. A man who builds his life around a private scoreboard, one that only he can see and only he can evaluate, becomes immune to comparison. Because comparison only has power when you're using someone else's metrics. What does your private scoreboard actually measure? Not what it should measure. What does it actually measure right now? For most men, if they're honest, the answer is visibility, wealth as proof of worth, status as evidence of value. These are all external, all contingent on circumstances you don't control. The Stoic shift is to build a scoreboard around character, around the quality of your judgment, around whether you did the thing you said you would do, regardless of outcome, around whether you acted with integrity when it cost you something. This kind of scoreboard is harder to cheat. It's harder to inflate. And it produces something that external metrics never will. A man who isn't waiting for permission to feel like enough. Feeling behind is not a verdict on your life. It's a signal from an external scoreboard you may have never consciously agreed to play on. The Stoics weren't asking you to stop caring. They were asking you to care about the right things. The question isn't whether you're behind. The question is, behind on whose terms? If this hits something real for you, the comment section is there.